What's going on, boxing family? This morning apparently we find out that Saul Canelo Alvarez is not the number one pound for pound king by ESPN, and we'll look into as to why and who they have chosen as the number one pick. Hit that like button, subscribe, stay tuned for more. Well, as I stated in the intro of the video, ESPN just let out an article explaining as to why they did not pick Saul Canelo Alvarez, and in fact, their number one pound for pound pick is Terence Bud Crawford. Apparently, Saul Canelo Alvarez hasn't done enough in the eyes of most of the people in the panel over at ESPN to overcome the likes of Terence Crawford on the pound for pound list. There was a hot debate in this article between two writers over at ESPN, one analyst being Cameron Wolf and the other being Ben Baby, and it goes as such. Wolf picked Terence Crawford and based his pick on Terence Crawford's domination from the lightweight division up to the welterweight division, and saying that no one has done or had a run in the likes since Floyd Mayweather Jr. himself. He does give up some praise for Alvarez to a degree, but he also states that he lost the Golovkin fight. He had a draw with Golovkin and his loss to Mayweather. Later on, going on the article, referencing back to the Mayweather fight and saying he can't get that out of his mind. To a degree, that's quite biased. Sure, Canelo lost. It was at a point in time where he was much greener, much earlier in his career, and this was before he had really developed into a solidified fighter or had developed his proper style as to what we see now. Another thing interesting to note was that Wolf stated that he picked Crawford based on the eye test. Now, if you base things off the eye test alone, is Terence Crawford more impressive than Canelo? Yes, he has more athleticism. He has a lot more intangibles going for him. However, when you reach a point in the higher or the top echelon of the sport and you're talking about levels, you're no longer just basing anything on eye tests alone. Eye tests are usually, for my opinion, reserved to fighters who are on the come up, prospects, fighters who are contenders, who are potentially looking to land a fight against a champion, not for fighters that have already been established, in fact, throughout different weight divisions and have reached the top of those set divisions. And so, unfortunately for Crawford, he doesn't have the resume. He's just came off the win against Brook, who had his face broken 2 different times by 2 different fighters and was a shell of his former self. And the stable that he has over at Top Rank is very malnourished. His resume is extremely skin and bones. There's hardly anything there, no real names there. Is it his fault? Obviously not, but we can't just not hold any accountability to the fighters. He has to also try to make a push for certain fights to land. You look at fighters like Errol Spence Jr., who, yes, he has full stable over at PBC with all the star-studded fighters and names in the 147-pound division, and he's making all these fights happen. Unfortunately for Terence, he isn't. And how could you be the number one guy in your weight division if you haven't faced any of these fighters? You can't base anything on hypotheticals, especially when you haven't taken on any of those names. You haven't taken on the likes of Sean Porter, you haven't taken on the likes of Danny Garcia, Errol Spence Jr., Manny Pacquiao, Keith Thurman. All these fighters, sure, all those fighters, like I said, are on the PBC stable, and it's not Terence Crawford's fault. But he has to do something about it and not just sit idly, and he has to go out there and try to actively hunt these fights down. Let Bob Arum know, hey, I need these fights, I need these for legacy, I need these to establish myself further and be the number one guy at the weight division. How could you be the number one pound for pound king in the eyes of Mr. Wolf but not have faced any of the other top names at your weight division? You're not even the number one guy at your weight division. It just doesn't make any sense. Anyway, Baby goes on to say Canelo has looked extremely impressive since his loss to Mayweather. He has wins over the likes of Shane Mosley, Miguel Cotto, Rislan de Lara, Golovkin, which were in the earlier half of the 2010s, a lot of those wins. And ever since, he fought Golovkin, he's been on a pretty substantial run. He fought Daniel Jacobs, Callum Smith. So these were all pretty good names, and I think that solidified him way ahead of many of the other names on the pound for pound list currently, especially over at ESPN. Baby making the argument that Canelo's over Terence Crawford, which I happen to agree. Pretty much just goes to explain that Canelo has more impressive growth throughout his career. He's masterfully improved his defense and counter-punching ability, but now he could also switch over and bully bigger fighters, and we were witness to that in his latest fight on the 19th against Caleb Smith. Baby also goes to explain that although it's not Crawford's fault, makes the same argument I made earlier, Alvarez's resume is much deeper than Wolf, who's obviously defending Terence Crawford. Goes back to stating the obvious, which is it's not Crawford's fault that he's on the wrong side of the street, but like I said before, he also has to make a case for himself and actively try to hunt these fights down. They're not just going to come to him, especially with all the politically charged drama that goes on in the sport. Then Wolf goes on to say that Crawford is the meanest guy in the sport. Who's to say that he wouldn't have done what he's done to his past opponents, to any of the guys over at the PBC stable? Again, basing it on hypotheticals. We can't live in a dreamland. We have to live and face the realities of the situation. He does give credit to Canelo Alvarez, but he goes back to referencing the loss to Mayweather and that he can't get that image out of his mind. It's pretty much stuck in his head, and I think that's extremely biased. I mean, this is a fight that happened, 7 years ago against one of the greatest fighters in the history of the sport, and not only was Canelo much younger and didn't have the experience, but no excuses. Canelo lost fair and square, whatnot, and there was even some controversies there because of a scorecard that was given to Canelo, but nonetheless, he learned from then, and there's been a vast improvement ever since. And if you cannot see that, I don't know what to tell you. Then he goes on stating about the tainted meat. In one of the Golovkin fights, there was a whole issue with tainted meat. Nonetheless, those have been addressed, and Canelo has pretty much been cleared on that end. Does it stain some part of his career? Absolutely. I think you could look at it a little bit closer and with more discrepancies, but nonetheless, he cleared his name as best as he could, and he came back. He was clean. He followed all the rules. He was being tested and monitored, and everything worked out, and he's back to the top of the sport. Baby goes back to stating what I pretty much just stated, that yes, it was a drug failure and it was a blemish on Canelo's legacy to a degree, but Baby believes that Alvarez should get credit for not having any issues since, and I agree with that. Then Baby goes on to ask, what would it take for Canelo to become the #1 pound for pound king? And some of the names that pop up would be another convincing win over Golovkin, or the WBC middleweight champion in Jermall Charlo, and that would suffice for Wolf to place Canelo Alvarez as the #1 guy. And see, I don't see it. Why would Canelo have to drop back down to 160, take on a guy he already beat, or Jermall Charlo, if he already stated that he's going to stay at 168, super middleweight division? He said that he feels comfortable there. He doesn't want to go back down. He doesn't want to move up too far. He wants to become undisputed at 168. So if that's the case, and he is at the top of the sport, and at least in regards to popularity, because not according to ESPN based on talent and skill, why would he have to be the one that comes back down? I would much rather see either Golovkin, Charlo move up, or Canelo go on with his mission on becoming undisputed champion at 168. Then if we look at the rest of the pound for pound list, obviously for ESPN, Terence Crawford's #1, Canelo Alvarez remains put at #2, Naoya Inoue remains #3, Errol Spence Jr. at #4, Teofimo at #5, Tyson Fury at 6, Vasily Lomachenko at 7, Alexander Usyk at 8, Juan Francisco Estrada at 9, and Gennady Golovkin and Gervonta Davis tied for #10. There's a lot of differences in between this pound for pound list and my own, but then again, the sport of boxing, rankings are very subjective unless it's a fighter that goes out there and absolutely clears out a division. Nonetheless, it's pretty solid. I don't understand why Gennady Golovkin and Gervonta Davis are tied. Gennady Golovkin has come off a fight against Sergey that many deemed as a loss as well, and then he fought Kamil Zermeta, and it was rather unimpressive, carried him throughout 7 rounds before putting him away or getting the fight called off. And then Gervonta Davis came off of a spectacular one-punch knockout over Leo Santa Cruz. Granted, Leo, it's not his natural weight division, but it was pretty impressive. Nobody had done that to Leo Santa Cruz, and Leo Santa Cruz was really making a good effort in and making a real good name for himself in that fight in the early stages. But nonetheless, I digress. Going back to the main meat of this video is there's no way, and from my point of view, that Canelo Alvarez should be ranked number 2 below Terence Crawford, especially with, like I've stated before, such a weak resume that Terence Crawford has and his lackluster accomplishments ever since he moved up to 147. I think he should look into potentially moving on to the next, the other side of the street to land the bigger fights, especially at this point in his career when he's 33. So hopefully he's able to land a few big fights before he starts declining. And obviously Canelo Alvarez, he's a free agent now, so hopefully we'll land a few good fights. We get to see him against the likes of Caleb Plant, perhaps Jermall Charlo moves up, David Benavidez, there's Billy Joe Saunders. There's quite a bit to see at 168, and I can't wait to see how both of these guys' careers turn out, and I'm excited. Don't agree with the ESPN again, but to each their own, and I appreciate you guys' time for tuning in. Hit that like and subscribe button and stay tuned for more.